Question at the back and then Amber.
What do you see in terms of the symptoms, hair loss, loss of teeth, liver function, etc.? Are there any medical records of all this, or is that simply unknown?
It's something I try to pay acute attention to when I meet any of these people who have been dabbling with mercury, in some cases for decades. And I haven't, I mean, there are some you see who seem, you know, don't seem to be great examples of shining health. And yet I have not seen any of the kind of acute symptoms or even chronic symptoms that one would tend to look for, as you mentioned, in issues of...
no medical data on it.
In terms of medical data, it's an area that I haven't explored yet. This is really actually a project that's sort of still in its early phase. But one of the things I look forward to doing very much is looking at kind of alternative perspectives on this, particularly, let's say, Burmese physicians who have been trained in the biomedical model, who probably will, in many cases, look at this tradition very, very suspiciously and may have evidence that would be otherwise, you know, potentially even ignored or suppressed by those who were trying to advocate this tradition. So that's something that I look forward to exploring, but I don't have a lot of information on at this time.
My question follows on, because you asked really about signs, and I was wondering about symptoms. How do people talk about whatever they experience? I mean, do they talk about it? How do they characterize it? You know, do they talk about a sense of improved well-being? Do they describe symptoms? How does it happen?
Yeah, in terms of symptoms, no one I ever asked, and it was always part of the questions, is whether they ever saw the potential for negative side effects or whether they ever had experienced any, and none of them have. So even though they are often exposed very clearly to mercuric fumes and other processes, they believe that whatever they're exposed to on that kind of gross level is compensated for by the regular ingestion of mercury in its purified form, and that will actually be a corrective to whatever exposure there has been to elemental mercury and its toxic effects.
Yeah.
In small doses.
Well, you can imagine
because I know the Chinese tradition, and I couldn't understand why there's all this issue about longevity. I thought there must be a mediating circumstance, even though people were recognising the deleterious effects by many times. They were still continuing to use it, and it did fade out in the end because the deleterious effects were recognised more concretely. But I think even...
Can you speak a bit louder? Sorry.
The deleterious effects were recognised more concretely by medieval times, but the continued use, I think, is related to the psychoactive effect. Now, that hasn't been proved, but there were some signs in your translation, your first translation, that was also the case in the Burmese tradition. And it's just that nobody's done that history. They look at either the medical effects or the...
Yeah, exactly. But I was wondering about, you know, contemporarily, you're actually photographing people who currently use it.
Yes.
And they seem perfectly ready to show you.
They're very, very ready. It's not a hidden tradition in that way.
So I was wondering then whether they were ready to talk about, you know, any psychoactive experience.
They do, and I think that's also indicated in you know, in that quotation from an Indian institute, in fact, that's still involved in a comparable or analogous tradition of purifying mercury. And they describe something that was also very much described in Burma, which is the kind of stilling of thoughts, which of course is one of the goals of shamatha meditation. And it's believed that the ingesting of mercury will have that kind of effect, where it kind of quiets the mind. Now, of course, is that involved because there's rapid neurological, you know, damage to brain cells? I mean, one can speculate that, you know, we all know what it feels like suddenly when thoughts aren't arising, and it's not always because of some luminous clarity. It may just be because the, you know, brain fog, which is, of course, one of the subjective symptoms of mercury toxicity. But nonetheless, none of them ever describe it in that kind of deleterious way, where it would be also associated with loss of energy, etc. But quite the opposite. They find it energizing. Many claim to sleep only, you know, a couple hours a night. In the Taoist tradition, one teacher I spoke to, and that they said, who was very, very skeptical and worried, he said, no, in the tradition they recognize that actually the ingestion of mercury, and this is an area I haven't explored otherwise, it actually leads to an increased red blood cells, and therefore to euphoric states and even visionary and psychic states. But then after a while, it leads to rapid death. So this was a contrary view from the Taoist perspective that nonetheless recognized that at least in the short term, or claimed that in the short term, there were very definitely psychic effects and mental effects that would be considered potentially positive. But then it also brings up, interesting speculations as to, what we might see as being mad as a hatter. Is that some kind of divine madness in an Eastern context? So there are a lot of areas to explore, I think, in this.
Axel Klein has a question.
Mm-hmm.